And so now I have the pleasure of introducing Haley Kragness. It's actually pretty special because she was a graduate student at McMaster University, one of our star students, and we had a wonderful time and missed her so much when she left. And she also worked for a time in the Live Lab, so that was also something that's pretty nostalgic. So during her PhD, she did some very impactful work on children's musical expressions, showing how they delineated phrase boundaries and how they expressed emotions. And after graduating in 2019, she went on to do a postdoc with Laura Sorelli at the University of Toronto, and they did some really seminal studies on musical behavior and development in young children in realistic environments. And looking at interactions between parents and infants and between siblings and so on. So from there, she was hired as an assistant professor of psychology at Bucknell University in Pennsylvania. And there she works mainly with undergrads, but she's done really incredible work coming from there on the social impact of musical engagement in early childhood. So she's doing very creative studies, the role of music in young children's lives. She's particularly interested in how music is experienced in the real world, and the impact that this has for development. So please welcome Haley.
Thanks, Laurel. Thanks again to Laurel for inviting me. As Laurel said, it's really special to be here. And it's been so fun. It's been such a exciting past couple of days. And I'd also like to thank the speakers who came before. They could not have teed me up better for this final talk. It was a really nice trajectory that we've had through early development, and I'll talk a little bit more about sort of older children now. And so, yeah, a little bit of background briefly. I'm here in the middle of Pennsylvania at Bucknell University. As it's actually only a little bit less than 5 hours away from here, so not too far. And as Laurel mentioned, my lab is composed of undergraduates. I have a delightful, enthusiastic team of folks. But I did want to mention this because we actually do, little known, have a master's program in psychology. And it's pretty special because it's a funded master's program, which is pretty hard to find. So tuition waiver and stipend. So if you know anyone, or you are someone who is able and willing to come to the States and you're interested in something like this, please do think about me and connect me. All right. So today, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about what I'm thinking about as musical engagement. And I'm kind of drawing on this literature on musicality and thinking about musical engagement as being all kinds of forms of participating in music. And one way we can see diversity in this is by looking across cultures, looking all over the world, looking through time, right? Looking back into ancient times, even looking 50 years ago, people's musical participation was different in lots of different ways than it is today. And other folks are doing some really great work trying to understand cultural diversity and music engagement. And even if we look in one culture, we can see person to person, there are really big differences in how we engage in music and how much we engage in music. And that's kind of the overarching question that I've been trying to think about lately. And I think this is an important question to understand, what might drive people to engage in music in particular ways. And as we've heard from others today and yesterday and across the literature, engaging with music can have benefits at different points across the lifespan. So Asal talked earlier about neurocognitive benefits, and there's sort of this ongoing fascinating discussion in the literature about near and far transfer, but the implication is that there are some cases where musical engagement can benefit cognition. We know there are social and emotional benefits, although Asal actually showed us some data maybe that doesn't support that earlier today. But in some situations, we can certainly see social and emotional advantages with people who have experienced music in specific ways. And there's also been some exciting work looking at, for example, how musical experiences like music training or choir singing might mitigate age-related decline in auditory function. So we're looking like across the lifespan here at how engaging in music can potentially be beneficial. So for me, this is an important question to start to understand. So when I'm thinking about this question, I'm using sort of a framework, a lens that I think can help us to try to understand this. If you ever took a developmental psychology class, I really hope that this is familiar to you. And this comes from a classic theory of development referred to as ecological systems theory. The idea here is that individuals, as they develop, are affected by their environments that are proximal to them and also the environments that are less proximal to them. And the sort of crucial thing is that individuals shape their environments as well, right? So there's reciprocal interactions between all of these levels. And we can see this kind of reciprocal interaction happening across lots of different areas of development. One area that I think is like a nice demonstration of this is the relative age effect. So if you haven't heard of this, the idea is that if you look at, for example, like professional sports players, you can see that there is people who were born early, who were relatively old for their cohort of school, are overrepresented in these sort of high-level physical expertise professions. And Rafa actually just recently showed something similar in music conservatories, I believe, right? So people who are old for their cohort are overrepresented. And we can think about why this might be the case. And I think this lens does a nice job of explaining it. So if you are a young child entering a space and you have there may be pretty big differences between an old 5-year-old and a young 5-year-old, right? And so you're all entering this space together, and maybe you have an advantage, either cognitively or physically, if you're older. And if you're doing well, you might get a lot of internal reward from that. You might be getting external feedback from the people around you who are telling you, wow, you're doing such a great job. That might reinforce the likelihood that you're going to keep sticking with it, right? So we can think about how all of these different factors interact with each other as we develop. So I'm far from the only person thinking about how musical engagement factors might be related to this. We know that there are genetic factors and like personality factors, for example. There are many different ways that this has been looked at before, but I'm going to try to put my little piece into this puzzle and tell you about stuff that we've been doing to try to answer this. So I'll talk about sort of 3 broad domains. One is musical abilities, then musical rewards, and then finally I'll talk about beliefs, which is mainly work that I've been doing with my students at Bucknell. So let's start with musical abilities. This is work that I did in collaboration with Swathi Swaminathan, Glenn Schellenberg, and Laura Shirelli when I was at University of Toronto. And actually, we kind of did this study out of practicality. Glenn had like a very limited amount of time and money left at UTM. I think we were like 6 months or something like that. And we were like, what's the most interesting thing that we can do in that limited amount of time? So what we decided to do was build off of a data set that Swathi had already collected as part of her dissertation, where she measured children's music perception abilities. So in this study, we focused on music perception specifically. So when we say musical abilities, I'm not talking about production abilities. And in order to measure music perception, we use tests that are something like this, discrimination tests of melody and rhythm. So this is the adult task. If you haven't heard it before, it's the musical ear test, the MET. And I'm going to ask you to do a couple trials here. So your task is to say whether these are the same or different rhythm. All right, here we go. Who thinks they were the same? Who thinks they were different? You guys have a great ear. What about this one? Same? Different. They were different. Okay, so these are pretty hard trials, actually. So the musical ear test has some that are pretty easy and some that are pretty hard. And actually, I do think that it is harder over the speakers. I have experienced that. But as you can see, adults actually score really variably on this musical ear test. Some people score at chance, some people score 100%, right? So we can get at individual differences using this kind of assessment. So what Swati had done was she had, at time 1, kids who ranged from 5 to 10 years old, and their music perception abilities were measured with the MBIMA, which, if you don't know, is like what you kind of just did, but it's a lot easier, and it's sort of gamified, so it's for kids. And then we called all those folks back and asked them to come to the lab when they were either somewhere between 10 to 15 years old. So this is 5 years later. And I think in her sample, she had had 90 kids, and I think we got about 44 back. So almost 50%, which is like pretty good for 5 years later. I think it was more than I expected, actually. So we measured their music perception abilities again. We had them do the MBIMA, but it's like pretty much too easy for them at that point. So we had them do the MET as well. And we measured lots of different things that we thought might be related to their music training in that time period, or music experiences in that time period, such as music training. Okay, so the first question that we wanted to ask was, how stable is this ability over time? So the first thing that I want to say is that they all got better, right? So that's good. So it's 5 years later, right? So they definitely all got better. So what we're doing here is we're plotting normalized values, right? So this is the principal component of all of those music perception tests. At time 1 on the x-axis, the principal component of all of those music perception tasks on the y-axis at time 2. And what we saw was that there was a really strong positive correlation. Okay, so that suggests to us that this is actually pretty stable. For reference, I think if you do measures of intelligence, you get sort of pretty similar correlations across about 5 years. If you ask measures of personality across the same time period, which we think of as like kind of stable, right? Personality is pretty stable trait. The Pearson R values you get for that are more like 0.5, right? So to me, this looks pretty darn stable. So something I didn't show you in that first example with the adults, first figure over here, but that you probably noticed, is that there's 2 different types of dots on the screen. We have these red circles and the green crosses. And you may have already intuited that those correspond to 2 different types of participant. The green ones are professional musicians, and the red ones are actually non-musicians, right, in that original sample. And as you can see, validating the MET, right, it makes sense that the musicians are doing better than the non-musicians at this ear test. They should, right? But of course, this raises a lot of questions about which came first, the same kind of thing that Asal is trying to investigate in her work. Is it that the kids who have good musical abilities then go on to become professional musicians, or do they get better at taking music perception tests as a result of their music training? So we can't 100% answer that question, but we can try to start to get at that. And so what we did was we did multiple regression to try to understand which factors best predicted their musical ability at time 2. And what the best predictor was their musical ability at time 1. Their auditory short-term memory also was a significant predictor, which makes sense because that's like required for the type of task that we're asking them to do. But their music training didn't actually come out as a significant predictor. The other thing we tried to do to understand this music training variable was we looked at the predictive value of time 1 musical ability to time 2, and then saw if adding in the amount of music training they had in that intervening time predicted more variance in their time 2 musical ability. And then we did the reverse as well, right? So we looked at how much their music training predicted their time 2 ability, and then saw if adding more their time 1 musical ability then gave us more predictive power. And that indicated that the thing that was really going on was that their time 1 musical ability was predicting the amount of intervening music training they had, right? So I think this is like a nice demonstration of the same type of thing that we might be seeing with Rafa's relative age effect data, right? Whereby having those sort of a priori good ear skills then makes it rewarding and a more enjoyable experience to engage in music lessons. So far, we've seen that music perception ability is pretty stable over 5 years in childhood, and that it predicts subsequent engagement in formal musical training. Okay, so that's one piece of the puzzle. So the second piece that I'm going to talk to you about is musical reward. You've heard a little bit about this if you came to my talk last night, but I'll try to tell you more today. Yeah, we thought this might be an important factor to look at because, of course, if you enjoy something, you're going to spend more time doing it. Right? And there's now quite a robust literature looking at musical reward in adult populations and looking at individual differences. For those of you who are maybe unfamiliar with this, there was an initial literature of case studies demonstrating that some folks do not actually derive much pleasure from music, which is, for those of us who do, it's quite hard to understand. It seems like a pretty foreign experience. And in these case studies, there was sort of a precipitating event, right? So like a brain surgery where, I loved music before, I always used to listen to it, then I had a traumatic brain event or a brain surgery, and no longer, all of a sudden, I don't love music anymore. I'm not getting the kind of pleasure that I was getting before. And as this literature grew, it became clear that there were some people who were perfectly, as far as we can tell, neurologically healthy, and say, hold on, I've never liked music. That describes me like my whole life. So this is an example of one of those folks. I found this video pretty recently on TikTok.
You don't like music.
I don't like music.
All music?
Some music I dislike less than others. Music that connects back to childhood or possibly my teenage years, pop songs, I can kind of enjoy those. I don't get joy out of music in the way that other people do. It's taken me about 5 years ago to realize that I am not normal in this way, and there is
Okay, so there's a lot in there to talk about, a lot to unpack, I think. But the main thing that I want you to draw from that is how different her description of her experience with music seems to be than what I think probably most of the people in this room would say their experience with music is. Like, she says, I dislike some music less than others, which implies that she pretty much dislikes it all, right? And so on this case study side, we could maybe think of this as an acquired musical anhedonia, right? Anhedonia meaning not hedonic, pleasurable. So acquired because it happens after a precipitating event. On the other hand, we have these folks who are saying this is how I've always been, and maybe we can think of this as like a congenital musical anhedonia. And I was talking to my collaborator, Amy Belfi, about this idea, and she said, I've tried to refer to this as congenital musical anhedonia, but I get pushback because when I say that, people say, well, you really need to show that it's developmentally stable, that it's happening early in development in order to call it congenital, which is a fair point. So that was the precipitating factor. That was the motivation for this work. For those of you who are unfamiliar, there is a pretty gold standard, very common way now to measure individual differences in musical reward, which is the Barcelona Musical Reward Questionnaire. It looks like this. It's quite blurry. But you're asked to say how much you agree with statements covering different facets of musical reward. So things like, I like to listen to music that contains emotions. Okay, how much do you agree with that? I don't like to dance, not even with music I like, right? So reverse coded these kinds of questions. And when we look at a population of healthy, neurologically healthy adults, we see a lot of variability in this final score on that measure. And then typically, to identify someone as being musically anhedonic, we also need to say, well, they get pleasure from other things, like food and sex and gambling and other origins you might get reward from, but your displeasure is specific to music, right? What Nick Cathius and others have done is use the physical anhedonia scale to look at that general pleasure measure, right? So if you're low on general anhedonia and also low on musical reward, then that means your anhedonia is specific to music. So our question was, could we, okay, so first of all, as we were thinking about this question, I think there's quite a lot of anecdotal evidence and also evidence in the literature that reward from music is observable pretty early. I think some of the things that Jen has showed us are related to that. I'm just using this as an excuse to show you a video of my child. I think he looks like he's having a great time. But of course, there's a lot of other things going on in that particular example. But as we were sort of Googling around, trying to understand this phenomenon, we came across a case like this. So this is a person who was sufficiently concerned about what they perceived as their child's lack of musical reward, that they posted about it on a parenting forum to be like, is this okay? Am I doing something wrong? The title is Son, age 10, doesn't like music. It seems strange that he seemingly doesn't like music at all. He gets annoyed listening to music when me or his siblings put it on. And then he says at the bottom, I know everyone's different, but is this something to be concerned about? I just never met any other person who doesn't like music at all. And he says he's actually developmentally doing well in other areas. He has good grades and has friends. Right? So that's suggestive of a sort of lack of musical reward in this case. And I've even found examples of parents saying, oh, my child doesn't like music, and my mother-in-law says it's because I always used to play the Metallica in the car, and that I messed him up. So certainly there seem to at least anecdotally be some of these kinds of cases. So we wanted to know, Amy and I, could we adapt the BMRQ to capture individual differences in musical reward in a developmental sample? And then if so, can we identify a profile that seems to imply that or an early emerging musical anhedonia, specific to music? So we adapted the BMRQ. For those of you who are in the know about musical reward, we didn't adapt the eBMRQ. So some folks have adapted the BMRQ to include another factor, which is musical absorption, which asks people about the extent to which their experience with music makes them feel sort of transcendent, or like they're floating, or like they're in another place, these kinds of things that would correspond with being narratively absorbed by the music. We intentionally did not include that factor because we thought it would be extremely hard to probe the internal experience of their child in that way. So that was the choice that we made, but I would definitely be curious to hear anybody's ideas if about potentially including that going forward. We recruited parents from Prolific, and this was a couple of years ago, so I don't think they were AI-generated responses, but we have to be worried about that now. And we did what we could to at least, to try to adapt every item as closely as we could to be, instead of thinking about yourself, to judge about your child. So that looked something like this. Instead of an item that says, when I share music with someone, I feel a special connection with that person, that would be presented as, when my child makes music with someone, they appear to have a special connection with them. Okay? Okay, so how about this piece about the anhedonia being specific? So we needed to find a way to measure sort of a general hedonia or anhedonia. And what we chose to use was the Child Behavior Questionnaire, which is a measure of temperament. And that questionnaire has 3 factors underlying: negative affectivity, surgency, which is kind of like tendency to approach, and effortful control, which is related to attention and inhibition. And so we thought the negative affectivity subscale would give us something sort of a proxy for general hedonia, or anhedonia rather, because it's reversed. Okay, so let's first look at distributions. So this is an adult distribution on the BMRQ, and what we can see is that there's sort of a nice bump where most of the people are falling, but a long tail on the left-hand side, which are the folks who are not experiencing much musical reward. So if we compare that to our child sample, we see something like this, which is a pretty similar distribution, actually. We can see that little tail on the left-hand side. So that implies that there are some folks who are saying their kids are not experiencing much musical reward. You might say, okay, Haley, 3 to 7-year-old is a pretty big age range. What a parent might be able to judge about a 3-year-old is really different than what they can judge about a 7-year-old. So we looked at the correlations with their child's age, and there was no correlation whatsoever. Very flat distribution, or very flat regression line. And one thing that I should have said, but I forgot to say, was that we picked 3 to 7 because that was the age range for the CBQ, so for the temperament questionnaire. So we sort of designed the study around that. Okay, so again, in that bottom left-hand side, we have our sort of adult musical anhedonics. So what does it look like if we plot something similar for the children? We find about 8% of the kids fall into that category. And if we compare that to data from other studies, such as Nick Cathia's sample here, they say about 6% of adults fall into that category. So 8%, we're finding something pretty similar. All right. So something that we did was tried to look at the factor structure of the adapted questionnaire. And over the lifetime, I think it's reasonable to assume that the relative importance of these factors might shift. The way that the questions relate to each other might change. Okay, so what did we see? 2 of the factors were essentially preserved. In the original BMRQ, there are 4 questions for each of these subfactors or factors, but for mood regulation and emotion evocation, 3 of the 4 were retained in our factor structure, which I think is interesting. I'm happy to chat with us later about why those might have been particularly preserved. For these other 3, they actually all loaded onto one factor, which we call musical engagement. So they all kind of hung together, or a lot of items from each of those hung together. For sensorimotor reward, something kind of interesting happened. So we kind of expected to see sensorimotor reward emerge also as a preserved factor because we know that babies are sensitive to movement really early and that that's an important part of their music processing experience. But what happened was that the questions related to movement and dancing hung together, and the questions related to humming and singing hung together, but didn't go together across the factor. And actually, we're not the only people who have seen this. There has been another validation of the BMRQ with Danish adolescents, and another one with, I think, a population in China, where they saw something really similar to this. So that sensor motor subfactor breaks off based on these two sort of subfactors. Okay, so let's look at how the BMRQ related, their scores related to their temperament scores. Because something pretty interesting emerged that I would love your help in explaining. So as expected, nothing was related to negative affect. And that kind of validates, again, that idea that there's no relationship between their musical reward and general reward. Same for surgency. For effortful control was correlated with every single subscale and also with their total reward score. Pretty robustly. So we went back and looked at that subscale, and it turned out that there were some items that were music related. And we took out those items, and we thought, okay, once we take out those items, then that correlation is probably going to go away. And it actually got stronger in like every case. So as I said before, effortful control is thought to reflect sort of inhibition and attention. We can think of it as being maybe related to the things we typically think of as executive function. So I think we can probably think a little bit about how that might relate to musical engagement. So if you are getting a lot of musical reward, a lot of pleasure from music, and you also tend to have good executive function, then those two things together seem like a pretty good recipe for you to become engaged in music, right? But I think we need more. We need more to fully understand that. But I'd be really interested to hear what you all have to say. Okay, so from that, just to summarize, we found pretty substantial individual differences in that age range, and that some kids seem to have a profile that reflects musical anhedonia, and that the factors contributing are somewhat consistent between children and adults, but also have some differences. I think one possible explanation is that there's early in development, there's actually not much differentiation between these factors, and that our experience of musical reward becomes more and more differentiated as we grow. I think that's one possible factor. We can think about how maybe in adolescence, certain factors might be particularly important, like social reward. These are, as far as I know, untested hypotheses. But an obvious question is, how stable is this? And we talked about the stability of the musical perception abilities. How stable is musical reward? So are the kids whose parents are saying they don't get much pleasure from music, do they grow up to be musically anhedonic adults? It's currently 3 years after we initially sent that survey to parents, so we're sending it back to folks again right now, so I will let you know. I'm also working on, we have some pilot data. I'm collaborating with Psyche Louie on NSF-ROA, where we did a retrospective version where we asked people to think about themselves as adolescents and themselves as children, and looked at how well their responses correlated across time for themselves. So that's something that we're trying to do right now. And Amy and I are currently also working on trying to develop a baby BMRQ, and that project is in its own infancy. So I'd be happy to hear anybody's thoughts about that. All right, so for this final section, I'll talk to you a little bit about work that I've been doing. This is primarily with my undergraduate students at Bucknell. They really got me thinking about these questions and took the lead on authoring this work, which is really fun for me. And so they were very curious to try to understand how people's beliefs might be related to the way they engage in music. So hopefully what I mean by that will become clear as I go on. We try to tackle this in a couple different ways, but the first question the idea that we were trying to investigate had to do with gender. So I think yeah, maybe we all have some sort of internalized understanding, but we see this in the literature that adults and children believe that some instruments are for girls and others are for boys. So if I was going to ask you guys in the center, all of you, if you were going to put instruments on a continuum, and over here was the most feminine instrument, what would you put on that end? 1, 2, 3? Flute. Okay. All right, so people on this side and on this side, if you were going to put something on the most masculine end, what would you put? 3, 2, 1? Interesting. Okay. So this is what we see. I heard a lot of flute. I heard a couple drums. This is a pretty robust continuum. So if you ask kids or adults to take a bunch of instruments and put them on that gender continuum, over and over and over several decades, we see the same kind of pattern of results. You'll be happy to learn that the extremes have sort of compressed over the years. So that's good, right? It's sort of maybe reflecting some social progress in our understanding or our how we convey gender ideas to kids, hopefully. But the order is still relatively stable, right? And I think an interesting question is how do these associations come to be? And one pretty prominent explanation in the past literature is that is about exposure, right? So if you go to the orchestra and you see these 4 flutists and 3 of them present as women and 1 presents as a man, then you might rationally say, okay, well, flute is for girls, it's for women, right? And another sort of piece of evidence that bolsters this explanation is that if you repeatedly expose kids to gender incongruent pairings, so if you show them over and over James Galway, eventually they're like, okay, I guess men can play flute too. And so that seems to bolster this explanation. We thought there might be some other things going on. So instruments vary on lots of different properties, and we thought that these properties could potentially act as cues to assimilate into pre-existing gender schema. So gender schema are like the categories that we have about what kinds of things boys do, what kinds of things girls do. We see gender schema appearing pretty early. If you imagine you've never seen this instrument before and you see it like this, you might assimilate it into your category for girls, right, based on particular features. So we thought that there might be some features that happen in real-world instruments that might act as these kinds of cues. And we identified 3 that we thought would be potentially important, which is size, loudness, and pitch. So specifically, we hypothesized that smaller, softer, and higher instruments would be perceived as more feminine and the reverse for masculine. So we tested kids, first of all, 8.5 to 11-year-old kids. That was our primary age group that we started with because that's when around the age when we start to see real-world instrument gender associations emerge. We tested a little bit younger group and also our Bucknell undergraduates as a comparison group. So what we did, this is actually the work of Brandon Rickett, my honors thesis student. I thought this was really creative and fun. We created artificial instruments that he illustrated. He's not an artist, nor am I, so we made them in PowerPoint with like geometric shapes. And we tried to sort of standardize them so they were all like grayscale. And the intention was that they wouldn't resemble real-world instruments, first of all, and second, that there wouldn't be like a really obvious way to play the instrument, right? So you wouldn't like look at one of those and be like, you play it by this, or you play it by this, right? So they couldn't have those kinds of associations. Then he also created artificial timbres in GarageBand. So he took pre-existing synthetic timbres in GarageBand and then overlaid them on top of each other to create new timbres, which sounded something like this. Okay, so before moving on, I do want to say we didn't norm either the instruments or the sounds to be gender neutral. So there could be like a bias, a gender bias in our perception of any of these things, but we did our manipulations all within subjects, right? So our question is whether certain features push judgments more to the direction of male or female judgments. So on each trial, we presented the instrument as either large or small, loud or soft, or high or low. And the kids were asked had this backstory, like archaeologists have found this trove of instruments that no one has ever seen before. Who do you think should play the instrument? And on every trial, they were given the option to pick either a girl or a boy. And we didn't say, should the boy or the girl play the instrument, right? So we didn't necessarily orient their attention to the fact that there was always a girl option and always a boy option. And actually in debriefing, I think a pretty small percentage of them actually realized that in the end, or at least were able to consciously report that they noticed. Okay, so what I'm showing on the x-axis is that we split our sample of respondents into girls and boys because we thought that they might actually respond differently. And our y-axis is going to be the proportion of time that they pick boy. So if it's higher in blue, they're picking boy more often. So what do we see for size? So we didn't see any relationship in either gender about between size and the gender who should play it in any age group. No associations at all. We do see an increasing boy bias over time, and I would also be interested to hear what we have to say about that, but no size effect. For loudness, we saw something a little different. Boys who were 8 to 11 years old thought that boys should play loud instruments, but not girls. And not 6-year-olds to 8-year-olds, and not adults. Help me with that one, I don't know. And then finally for pitch height, we saw something, again, different, but a pretty robust pattern, which is that across all groups and all ages, people believed that lower instruments should be played more by boys than by girls. So the higher pitched instruments should be more played by girls. So that was our sort of pretty robust, the most robust finding that we had. So by 6 years old, it seems that these gender instrument associations are pretty robust, and that's earlier than we tend to see associations with real-world instruments, right? So for us, that is the inference that we're kind of drawing from that is that the pitch is acting as a cue to assimilate this novel object into a pre-existing gender schema. And we think that that could well happen in the real world as well, right? When the first time you experience an instrument, you might be looking for these kinds of cues to assimilate it into your social world. Of course, there's lots of other features that we could test. We picked some that we thought were relevant sort of theoretically and also drawing from the literature. On literature on instrument selection, but there's lots of other features we could pick. And we also haven't looked at all about at the question of instrument selection. So do these cues act as do these features act as cues for deciding what I should play because I am a girl, right? And so we haven't even scratched the surface of that yet, but it's a question we want to ask in the future. All right, so finally I have one last set of studies that I want to talk to you about, also about beliefs. And this set of studies grew out of some initial lab meetings that I had with my minions. And because we were interested in musical abilities, we read this review paper by Dan Levitin from 2012, where he says, like, sort of offhand, off the top, he says, a musical ability is popularly regarded to be innate. One either is or is not born with musical talent. And we thought, is that actually true? Do people believe that musical abilities are innate? You have it or you don't? And that was a question. We thought that's an empirical question. So we wanted to know where people believe musical abilities come from. And we also thought, well, that might be different depending on what kind of musical ability they're thinking about. We know there's lots of different ways that you might engage with or make music. So those were the driving questions that we wanted to answer. And to sort of set the stage or inform the way we were thinking about this, we drew from two sort of historical debates about ability in general. One is free will versus determinism, and the other is nature versus nurture. And if we think about these two debates, they kind of reflect three different causal origins. One being genetic, so nature and determinism imply a genetic origin. Nurture implies an environmental origin, and personal choice implies free will, right? Or free will implies choice, right? So we drew these three domains of explanation. So what we did was we asked people to think about a variety of abilities and asked them to judge where they came from. We didn't want them to know that we were interested in music. So we obscured that question by asking them about a bunch of different things. And we also wanted to verify that people understood the task. So we picked some that we thought should correspond with the three causal explanations. You should say that being tall is genetic. You should say that being nice we thought it would be like how you're raised, right? Environmental, and food preference should be a personal choice. Then we asked a bunch of other things. For musical characteristics, we wanted to try to sample across this musicality spectrum. So we asked about playing music, playing a specific instrument. We kind of arbitrarily picked cello to compare specific versus general music ability. Dancing, having a good sense of rhythm, and being a good singer. We had kind of a weird one here, too. We asked about someone who is emotionally moved a lot by music, and I recognize that doesn't really fall into the same category as the others, so we were just curious, right? It's another feature of our musical experience, but it is a little bit of an outlier. So what we did was we had, in our first study, we had an open-ended phase and a closed-ended phase. In the open-ended phase, we presented them with a person who is very good at such and such as the cello, gave a little illustration, people clap every time they play, and then we say, what caused them to be a good cello player, and gave them an open text box. And we did this with our Bucknell undergraduates in-house. And then we fully double-coded all of their responses for the presence of any of those explanatory categories, or like none of them, right? So their explanations could include 1, 2, 3, they could include any of them. So here's some samples of what people said. They have natural ability to sing, being exposed to music and dancing as a young child, so we coded that as environmental, athleticism from your family tree, or practice in a specific sport, so we coded that as genetic and as personal choice. And some people put like all three, right? Genetics, they study hard, good teachers, covering all of the causal explanations. And then we had a closed-ended phase as well. So our Bucknell students did that as well, but then we also then had a sample from Prolific, who just did the closed-ended phase. And we gave them, this is like exactly the same questions that they're getting after the open-ended phase, and then they're asked to rate how much they think each of these three causal explanations contributed, from not at all to just about all, right? And then our Prolific sample did also either got them as strengths or as weaknesses. So someone's very bad at the cello, people don't clap when they play, what caused them to be bad at cello? So what I'm gonna do here is I'm gonna aggregate across all of the musical abilities and show you the closed-ended responses first. Let's see, okay. So we have the musical strengths, and musical weaknesses across those two experiments. So what we found was across both samples, people rated personal choice as the most important factor for being good at any of these musical abilities in aggregate, and genetics as the least important factor. You'll notice that they rated them all as like moderately important, right? Which I think reflects, it's true, right? All of these things are important, but there was like this really consistent pattern. But not for musical weaknesses. We didn't see any differences for musical weaknesses. So the next question is, did their strength of causal attribution vary for different kinds of musical abilities? And I'll just try to show you the spark notes because there's a lot of dots. But the most important thing that we found was that for having a good sense of rhythm and being a good singer, people tended to rate that as more genetic than any of the other music abilities we probed. And we can see that reflected in their open-ended responses as well. So on the y-axis is the percent of participants who endorsed each of those explanations. They don't add up to 100 because they could have endorsed more than one. And we can see for rhythm and singing over here on the right-hand side, people tended to give more frequent genetic responses than for the other musical abilities. So to sum up, they primarily gave personal choice the strongest causal weight, genetics the least, especially genetic weight for singing and rhythm abilities. And so I think the next most important question here is whether beliefs predict behavior, right? So Sal actually gave like a nice little seed of this idea, right? When she was talking about in the question period, about like her friend who thinks of herself as being a tall person even though she's not a short person, and how that might shape her engagement in the world. I just saw a really lovely poster from Annabelle about singing and beliefs. And so I think it's important to understand whether beliefs map onto behavior. And we didn't measure that yet. That's something that we really want to do. But we did try to start to get at that in the prolific sample by asking people to evaluate how much causal weight each of those explanations had for their own musical abilities. So we said, think about yourself, how good you are at dancing, at clapping, at singing, all of these things. How much do you think that's attributable to your genes, your environment, your choices? And the causal weight they gave for those abilities in others was strongly correlated with their self-ratings. So I think we have some suggestive evidence that beliefs might be related to behaviors. We didn't measure behavior, obviously, but that's what we'd like to do next. And I do think, based on some of the data that I showed you earlier, for me, it doesn't make sense to be prescriptive about telling people that they must or should engage in music in a particular way. But I do think that it would be a real shame if someone didn't, for example, join a choir because they thought they couldn't, right? Because they thought they would never become a good enough singer. So for me, I think this is an important question to understand. Another, of course, important question is whether beliefs change across development. So these beliefs are in young adults and older adults that we measured. It might be particularly important to look at sort of sensitive periods for development, and also like the times when children are starting to take music lessons or right before they drop music lessons. Right? That's something we would really like to do. And we wonder if beliefs can be influenced to encourage participation in music for people who might actually benefit, but might not think that they would benefit. Just as a little teaser, we also did a version of this experiment with 5-year-old children. Here's a sample of their responses open-ended. I think he's just born a great dancer because they practice a lot, because God gave them a voice to sing, but some people don't have that. So they were very cute. We're working on understanding their responses right now. Just as, again, a quick preview, The left-hand side is adult responses, the right-hand side is kids, and they are overwhelmingly picking personal choice in their spontaneous responses. Could have something to do maybe with the messages that they get around that time about practice and personal responsibility, and you can do anything, you can be whoever you want to be, I don't know. So I'd be interested to hear your thoughts about that. Okay, so overall, in what I've shown you today, I've tried to relate musical engagement to individual differences in both ability and reward. We can think about the relationship cultural schema, like cultural ideas like gender schema might shape musical reward, and also beliefs. So we've really just started to scratch the surface of this, but I hope I've given you a little idea. I'd like to leave us with a final piece of food for thought. So this is inspired by all of the great work we've seen across the past couple of days and by the lovely work presented by the other three speakers. Over and over, people keep kind of coming up, I don't know, kind of keep asking this question about what should we do? As I said, I hesitate to be prescriptivist, but I'd like to just briefly talk a little bit about this idea that comes from Alison Gopnik. I've been reading this book. It's about parenthood, but I think we can think about how it relates to all the ways that we care for children as parents and also as society. And the central thesis that she has is that as a culture, we here in North America treat the work of parenting as that of a carpenter, right? Like, if you provide specific experiences, you can build the child that you're trying to build. And that causes a lot of stress in parents. But she says that a more fruitful way to think about caring for children is like a gardener, right? If you're a gardener, then you cultivate soil, and then you throw a bunch of seeds in the soil, and you don't know if you're going to get a sunflower, you don't know if you're going to get an orchid, right? But you'd like to create conditions where either kind of flower can thrive, right? And so I think maybe something we can think about altogether is what would it look like if we were cultivating musical gardens for our young people as parents and also as a society? I don't have an answer, but maybe all of you do. So with that, I'd like to thank all my collaborators and students, thank the organizers for the invitation and for all the hard work that you've put into making the conference happen, and all of you for your attention. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Haley. So much to think about. So we'll have some questions for Haley, and then we'll open it up. We'll have all of our speakers down here for our final panel. Oh, there's an online question, so we'll start with that.
This is a question from the online audience. For your musical anhedonia work, you spoke about controlling for general anhedonia. But do you know if the music anhedonics experience auditory general anhedonia or music-specific anhedonia? For example, do they enjoy engaging in other auditory-based tasks like listening to audiobooks or birdsong?
Yeah.
Or do they seek out silent auditory environments?
So Nick Cathius, whose data I showed you, did a study on this with Psyche and Ani Patel, and I forget the result. But it just came out. It just came out. I don't remember. But someone knows. Nick knows. And you too can know if you look up that paper. Okay, great. Thank you, Frank.
A really, really phenomenal talk, and it's just incredible to see sort of these different components of the research program. You sort of seeded us this question, but could you talk a little bit about the CBRQ and the music, the singing and dance splitting off, and some of, like, reasons besides reasons behind thinking about some of these different factor structures in children versus adults or in different adult populations?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, so the explanation for the distinction between the two subfactors, at least for example, in the Chinese sample, I think the explanation that they put forward is that culturally, the Chinese population draws heavily from like karaoke culture and stuff like that from adjacent cultures, and so it could be considered culturally normative to go out and sing all the time. So that's like not. We don't have the same attitude towards singing, and whereas dancing, which one must do with your body, is more awkward culturally. That's the explanation that was put forward. That doesn't help us with the kid data, but I do think, yeah, I mean there are different sets of behavior. I think like the data that Trin showed, the sort of preliminary stuff with the babbling, suggests that maybe there's some sort of common motor origin, but I think the vocalizing and moving a body are really distinct physical experiences, and so to me it's kind of not surprising that they break off that way. And I do think that probably if we had more items, that the sensory motor factor would be preserved. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, and I think another way, I think kind of thinking of the cultural way I was thinking about it is like in the original BMRQ, and if it's Western adults and how we treat singing and dancing in Western adult populations, why that they may have grouped together in a way that's maybe not promoting of music in the same way that, you might see those differences. So thanks so much.
Yeah.
Thank you. Check. Yeah. Thank you, Haley. It was good, an excellent talk. I was wondering about the first part, about the stability. How do you interpret those results? Like, it seems to be stable, but also seems to be 50% of the variability explained just because of the previous. So, what are your thoughts? Like, I was curious about to hear about the near transfer debate. If it is something stable, completely could be changed by musical training.
Yeah, I mean, I think, to me, I think it makes a lot of sense that the explanation is that you keep doing things that you are good at, right? You get messages from the people around you that you're good at it. You might feel that you're good at it. I think that completely makes sense. And when we're looking at the time period over which this is happening, we get those preteens that Asal was talking about. They have their own volition at that point. They can say, look, I'm done with this. I'm not enjoying it anymore. So to me, that's an explanation that makes a lot of sense. But also, it is important to acknowledge as well that our measurement of musical training was pretty coarse. So we were asking the parents to recollect, sort of with their child there as well, like how many years of music training they actually took. Oh, did I start that in March or did I start that in December? People have a hard time remembering. And so that's why I think it's super important for us to have the randomized control trials and also the level of detail about musical training that Asal's lab collects. That's super helpful. Yeah, does that make sense? Yeah.
First of all, very great work, and thank you for the talk. I thought it was very well presented as well. I was just curious about the findings you had with the CBMRQ, and I think the measure was cognitive control. I was just wondering what mechanisms you think are driving that correlation. One thing I had in mind was musical sophistication, and if that has an influence on that, I don't know if you've
Yeah.
looked at that, but do you think there might be other factors that influence cognitive control, if that was the actual measure that?
So it was effortful control,
Okay.
but that corresponds with things like inhibition, right? So it has it's temperament, but it has this sort of flavor of executive function. I don't know, and I also I added that slide in because Asal had been talking about inhibition and executive control. So I have to say that I have not continued to do more work to try to unpack that. But the fact that it's so robust is pretty striking across all of the subscales, even when we took those items out. So yeah, I really don't know. I would love to hear your explanations. Does Frank have an explanation? Maybe. Uh-huh. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. It sure is. Thank you.
Hi, here. Thank you so much for your talk. It was amazing. I really liked it. I have a question for the baby BRMQ that you're planning to do, of course.
Yeah.
And I mean, yeah, reward is notoriously difficult to measure in infants, right?
Yeah.
And I was wondering if you've also thought about the potential behavioral correlates of reward, and whether you have any thoughts on that. That would be really interesting.
Yeah, that's totally what we're trying to figure out right now. So I have a completely separate baby study that we're running right now, and we have an open-ended question at the end of that to ask parents, primarily mothers, to think about, to tell us a little bit about how they know when their baby is enjoying music, what that looks like, how do they know when their baby isn't enjoying music, what that looks like, just so that we can get an idea sort of on a broad spectrum of the kind of behaviors that parents are even noticing related to that. Because if we're going to ask parents to fill out a questionnaire about behavior, it has to be something they're noticing. And then, of course, there's a lot of literature we can draw on as well, like smiling. But I think smiling is of course, they can be experiencing pleasure without smiling as well. Yeah, that's our plan, is to draw on both of those responses and also the literature. In terms of behavioral correlates, we haven't gone there yet. But I think it would be a really great thing to be able to do. Yeah, and really crucial for validating the measure. Yeah, thank you. And I think dance would be a really fun way to do that.
I'll take another couple online unless there's someone else. Two questions from the online audience. They both relate to cross-cultural differences. The first is more straightforward. Have you or will you look at the size-gender correlation in preference for musical instruments cross-culturally? And then the second is about whether cultures are generally more nature or nurture focused in their beliefs, and if that might differ in different cultures. I'd also like to know if individuals think that musical abilities are more likely to be inherent, are less likely to engage in music when they do not perceive themselves as musically gifted.
Yeah, it's a great question. I'll start with the first question. So about whether we might look at the size association across cultures. I don't really have a mechanism to look at other cultures or to ask questions from people in other cultures, but if someone else does that, I'm happy to collaborate. But one thing I can say about that is, I was actually pretty surprised that one didn't come out. And Brandon's hypothesis, which I think is a good one, is that size might be important only when you have to lift the instrument. So for instruments that are just sitting there, like a piano or like a harp or something like that, maybe it's less important, the size aspect of it. Whereas a sousaphone, you gotta lift, right? I think that's a really good hypothesis, and I'd be eager to test that. But I'm not sure about the culture idea. And I'm also not sure what hypotheses one might make about culture in relation to size-gender associations. The other question was about musical abilities, and I think there's probably a very strong chance that these results are specific to Western Western folks, and our particular relationship with different types of music. And Annabelle's poster also made me think that we should look at gender differences in beliefs about these as well. So I think those are both really good ideas for future directions.
I'd like to invite all of the speakers to come down, and we can start our final panel.